When the wild turns, there is no warning. From the forests of Russia, the deserts of New Mexico, the frozen seas of Alaska, and the blinding storms across the Rockies, hunters discovered that nature does not negotiate. Grizzlies tear through tents in seconds, storms summon predators from the shadows, and even careful blinds and camouflage shelters offer no protection when instinct awakens. These are not accidents. These are calculated moments where the hunter becomes the hunted. Watch till the end to see how fast survival comes down to seconds. It was October 3rd, 2025. Deep inside the rain-soaked forests of Ussuri-Krai in eastern Russia, where thick cedar and birch trees grew dense over the rugged terrain. The ground was slick with mud, and cold rain had been falling since dusk. A group of 8 experienced hunters had traveled far from any village, setting up camp miles deep into the wilderness to track the region's giant Amur grizzlies. The area was known for its rich wildlife and harsh conditions. The hunters were used to long expeditions and had each taken part in dangerous trips before. Among them were Viktor Lebedev, a seasoned expedition leader in his early 50s with over 2 decades of hunting experience, and his younger partner, Artyom Sokolov, 36 years old, skilled at navigating remote terrain and setting secure camps. Both men had survived close encounters with predators in the past and were confident in their preparation. The rest of the group consisted of 6 other hunters, each with different backgrounds but all familiar with the dangers of Ussuri-Krai, where tiger and grizzly territories often overlapped. The camp was set up in a clearing beside a narrow forest river, chosen for its water access and relative elevation. Ground tents were arranged in a half circle near the fire pit, while Viktor and Artyom chose to sleep in a rooftop tent mounted on top of their truck for additional security. The rain poured steadily as night fell, pattering over canvas and metal. The smell of cooked meat still lingered faintly from their evening meal, and wet forest air carried it easily through the trees. The hunters stored their rifles close but rested with tired confidence, expecting the night to pass quietly. The forest around them was silent except for the steady hum of rain, dripping through thick branches and pooling in the soil. A wall of black pine and moss surrounded the camp, the darkness dense and impenetrable. Somewhere beyond the light of their campfire, the track of a massive grizzly lingered in the mud, wide and deep. The group had followed it earlier that day, but decided to wait until morning before advancing further. Shortly after midnight, the rain grew heavier, blowing sideways through the trees. The fire had nearly died out. Inside their ground tents, the 6 hunters slept unaware of the movement in the darkness beyond camp. From the shadows near the tree line, the enormous grizzly emerged, drawn by the scent of fresh meat and human presence. Its powerful body moved silently over the wet soil, water streaming from its thick fur. It approached the closest tent without hesitation, guided purely by hunger and instinct. Then the forest erupted. With a sudden burst of force, the bear tore straight through the first tent wall, ripping the canvas apart as if it were paper. Claws slashed downward with immense strength. The attack was fast, violent, and unstoppable. The first tent collapsed instantly under the bear's weight as it smashed through the canvas. In the darkness and pounding rain, the sleeping hunter inside had no time to react. The sound of tearing fabric, crushing force, and wet earth being torn apart filled the camp. Before the next tent could stir, the grizzly lunged again, its claws ripping through the second shelter with equal violence. The attack was not a warning. It was immediate and lethal. Each movement was fast, driven purely by instinct and power. Within seconds, the beast shredded the third and fourth tents, its massive frame crashing through nylon and metal poles as if nothing were there. The forest echoed with snapping branches, thrashing sounds, and the heavy impact of paws striking the ground. The rain muffled everything, soaking the camp and making every movement chaotic. The hunters inside the tents barely had time to move before being struck down. In less than 2 minutes, 6 lives were taken without resistance. No weapon was raised. No one escaped the ground before the bear reached them. Above the chaos, Victor and Artyom jolted awake inside the rooftop tent as the sound of destruction rose through the storm. They felt the vehicle shake from the force below. They grabbed their rifles and forced themselves to act through shock and fear. Their elevated position gave them one advantage the others did not have: time. They fired warning shots into the air, hoping to drive the predator back. The noise cracked through the rain and echoed across the forest. The massive grizzly slowed its assault but did not flee immediately. Rain soaked its fur as it turned its blood-covered head toward the truck, ears raised, breath steaming in heavy bursts. It paced in the open clearing, circling the camp with frustration, stamping deep holes into the mud. For a tense moment, the beast stood as if deciding whether to attack again. Then at last, with a last huff and a spray of wet soil, it turned and lumbered back toward the tree line, its shape fading into blackness among the trees. The forest fell silent again except for the relentless rain. Victor and Artyom did not descend until the first light of dawn crept across the sky. What they found below was devastation. The tents were unrecognizable, flattened and torn wide open. Mud was churned and dark with blood. Gear and supplies were scattered and destroyed. There were no survivors on the ground. The remote location and low visibility delayed outside help for many hours. When authorities and wildlife teams finally reached the camp, they described it as one of the fastest and most violent grizzly attacks recorded in the Amur region. Experts explained that large bears in this territory were extremely territorial, unpredictable, and often unafraid of human presence. Only the 2 hunters who slept above the ground survived, not by strength or weapon, but by sheer positioning. They left the forest forever changed, carrying with them a memory that few would ever fully understand. The attack became a grim warning across wilderness networks worldwide. It was August 29, 2024, high in the rugged mountains of western Colorado, where the sky felt close enough to touch and the wind carried the sharp scent of pine and wet stone. Mason Harlow, a 40-year-old hunter from Durango, had spent most of his life exploring alpine terrain. He was experienced in bow hunting and rifle tracking, known among fellow hunters for his patience and strong awareness of changing weather. His loyal hunting dog, a trained black Labrador, followed steadily at his side, alert to every sound and shifting scent. Together, they had climbed before dawn, aiming to locate a herd of elk that often crossed a high, grassy plateau before sunrise. Mason had hunted since childhood, raised in a family that respected the wilderness deeply. He believed that every hunt required discipline, not just skill. That morning, he carried his rifle slung over his shoulder, his clothing layered against freezing winds that could still sweep through the mountains during late summer. The trail was steep and rocky, winding past boulders and twisted tree roots. The sky began clear, with warm sunlight spreading across the plateaus, but the weather in the Rockies could change within minutes. By midday, dark clouds rolled in from the west, transforming the open cliffs from peaceful to threatening. Thunder rumbled far in the distance as the sky dimmed. Mason paused for a moment to judge the weather, sensing the pressure shift. His dog flattened its ears, unease visible in its posture. But he continued forward carefully, believing he still had time before the storm fully arrived. Elk tracks were fresh in the mud, and signs of recent movement encouraged him onward. The plateau opened wide ahead, slick with early rain as the first drops began to fall. Wind tore across the exposed ground, bending the tall grass sideways. Mason wiped water from his brow and scanned the far ridge through the storm haze. Then the sky flashed white. Lightning split the horizon, followed by roaring thunder that echoed across the sheer cliffs surrounding the plateau. The storm hit in full force, sheets of rain blurring the landscape. In that moment of distraction, danger arrived from the rocks. A large mountain lion emerged from the shadows of a boulder only 10 yards away. Its golden body moved low and silent, muscles coiled with instinct. The storm had made it anxious and hungry. In a sudden leap, it lunged toward Mason with terrifying speed. He tried to raise his rifle, but the metal was slick with rain. The weapon slipped in his hands and misfired. The mountain lion struck him across the shoulder and chest with powerful claws. The blow was strong enough to tear through his jacket and drive him backward. Pain surged through him as he stumbled, boots sliding on the wet ground. His dog barked and darted to the side, circling the predator. Mason scrambled toward the nearest slope, breath sharp in the freezing air as thunder rolled again above him. Mason forced himself forward up the slick slope, using his free hand to grab exposed roots and wet stones as his boots slipped against the loose gravel. Rain poured harder, soaking through his clothes, making each movement colder and heavier. The mountain lion followed with low, deliberate footsteps, its body lowered near the ground as it stalked him through the flashing light of the storm. The wind howled over the ridge, bending the scrub brush sideways while thunder shook the sky again like rolling earth. Mason's dog stayed just ahead of the predator, barking sharply, forcing the cat to keep glancing between its targets. The animal crept closer as Mason climbed the steep incline toward a narrow shelf of rock. His lungs burned from the thin air and sudden sprint. His shoulder throbbed from the swipe, and he could feel warm blood mixing with icy rain through the torn fabric. The ground gave way beneath him for a moment, sending gravel sliding down the slope as he dropped to one knee. The mountain lion seized the opening and lunged again, claws skidding over wet stone as it tried to regain grip mid-strike. Mason turned sharply and swung the butt of his rifle upward, striking the predator's foreleg. The impact shifted its balance just enough for him to scramble higher up the rocks. Lightning flashed once more across the sky, turning the storm into blinding white for an instant. The cat hesitated, its ears pinned back against the thunder's violent crack that rolled between the canyon walls. Wind and rain howled across the ridge. For a moment, predator and prey remained frozen in place, both soaked, breath steaming in the freezing air. Then, suddenly, the big cat stepped backward, muscles still tense but retreat already forming in its body language. Its tail flicked once through the water-soaked grass before it began to melt soundlessly back toward the cover of the timber below. In seconds, it vanished completely into the storm-dark forest. Mason stayed crouched against the wet rock, chest heaving, rain streaking down his face as the cold sank deeper into his skin. His dog returned to his side, shaking off water and glancing down the slope to make sure the danger had truly passed. The storm continued to rage across the plateau, wind sending sheets of water across the stone as lightning lit up the distant tree line again. Mason pressed his injured arm to his chest and began making his way along the ridge, following higher ground away from the attack site. Every step sent a shock of pain through his shoulder. but he pushed on steadily until he reached a rocky overhang that provided partial shelter from the rain. He checked the area carefully before settling down, heart still pounding. The cold air bit into his skin, and his body shook from both adrenaline and exposure. Yet he was alive. The storm raged across the mountains around him, thunder still echoing through the cliffs and peaks. The attack had lasted only moments, but it had shown how quickly control could vanish in the wild. By the time the storm began to fade in the distance, Mason understood with painful clarity that nature could strike from sky and ground at once. He had entered the mountains to hunt elk, but left with a much greater lesson burned into his memory. Even perfect planning meant nothing when the land itself turned against him. It was September 28, 2023, on the misty coast of Kodiak Island in Alaska, where damp fog rolled slowly across a quiet meadow at sunrise. The air was cold and still, the grass wet with dew, and the sounds of distant gulls echoed faintly from the shoreline. Wyatt Granger, a 46-year-old experienced hunter from Anchorage, sat hidden inside a camouflaged ground blind at the edge of the meadow. He had spent many years exploring Alaska's forests and islands, specializing in late-season deer hunts where patience and silence were essential. Wyatt came from a long line of hunters and had trained from a young age to read animal movements and weather shifts. He was calm, careful, and known for following every safety rule. He understood that Kodiak Island was home to some of the largest brown bears on Earth, and he always treated the wilderness with respect. That morning, however, he believed he was well prepared. He had built the ground blind himself with reinforced wood panels and camouflage netting. Inside, he sat with his .375H and H rifle resting across his knees and a pair of binoculars by his side. In front of the blind, he had scattered a small amount of dried salmon bait earlier at dawn. It was a legal and common method for drawing Sitka black-tailed deer into open view before they moved back toward the forest. The bait lay silent in the grass, barely visible from above. The morning was incredibly quiet. The only movement came from the low mist drifting between the spruce and alder trees nearby. Wyatt's breathing was slow and steady, his focus locked on the meadow for signs of deer silhouettes emerging from the mist. Minutes passed in silence. The world around him seemed still and calm until the peace was shattered in an instant. A deep, heavy thud slammed into the side of the blind without warning. The impact made the plywood walls tremble beneath Wyatt's boots. Another strike came immediately after, even louder than the first, cracking wood and rattling the entire structure. Wyatt did not need to see it to know what it was. Something far larger than any deer was right beside him. The next blow hit even harder, and part of the wall splintered inward as claws tore straight through the panel. A giant Kodiak bear, drawn by the scent of dried salmon, had stormed straight into the blind. Its massive weight rocked the structure as mud and broken wood scattered across the floor. Wyatt's rifle came up instantly. He fired 3 rapid warning shots into the dirt outside the opening, the recoil thundering through the enclosed space. But the bear did not flee. In a blur of motion, one enormous paw ripped through the torn panel and slashed across Wyatt's jacket. The claws tore through fabric and skin, cutting deep into his shoulder as the blind shook again under the force of the attack. Wyatt staggered backward as the massive paw withdrew for a moment, the plywood wall still flexing from the impact. His shoulder throbbed with sharp pain, warm blood soaking through the torn sleeve of his jacket. The blind, no longer stable, creaked and sagged as the bear circled outside, its heavy steps thudding against the soft ground. Every breath Wyatt took was tight and shallow, adrenaline flooding his body as he braced for another strike. He held the hunting knife firm in his hand, his rifle momentarily out of reach under splintered wood. The Kodiak came again. It crashed against the blind with terrifying force, its claws ripping wider through the opening. Snow-damp air rushed inside as the structure finally began to collapse. Wyatt lunged forward before the walls folded over him completely. In one desperate motion, he swung the blade upward toward the bear's face. The strike was not deep, but enough to jolt the animal back a few feet. The predator reared on its hind legs, towering above the ruined blind, its breath visible in thick white bursts as it growled across the meadow. Wyatt scrambled through the broken panel and into the wet grass, boots slipping as he forced himself to stand. The ground shook as the bear advanced again, circling, testing for weakness. It paced slowly, head low, ears pinned back. The scent of blood and salmon filled the air around them. Wyatt could barely lift his injured arm, but with his free hand, he raised the hunting knife once more, keeping his body low and angled. The Kodiak stepped closer. Wyatt slashed toward its front leg, kicking snow and dirt into its face. The sudden movement made the animal flinch, pausing just long enough to reconsider. It exhaled a long, heavy growl, turning its head toward the tree line as the echoes of the warning shot still lingered faintly in the distance. Its instincts fought between aggression and retreat. The bear circled once more, muscles tense before finally stepping back toward the fog-covered timber. Within seconds, it was gone. Silence returned as quickly as the chaos had erupted. The blind lay half-collapsed. Broken wood scattered across the meadow. Wyatt dropped to one knee, struggling to breathe as the cold began to bite through sweat-soaked clothing. Blood dripped steadily from his shoulder, staining the frost-covered grass. His arm shook uncontrollably as he pressed a hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. He forced himself to his feet and began moving toward the nearest snowmobile, which was parked several hundred yards behind the tree line. Every step sent jolts of pain through his shoulder, but the urgency to leave the open ground pushed him forward. The forest around him felt 10 times larger now, every sound sharper and heavier than before. Even with no sign of the bear, the sense of being watched lingered in the freezing air. At the resort medical cabin, staff later treated deep claw wounds and heavy bruising from the impact. Wyatt survived, but the blind was left destroyed, and the bait site was permanently removed. Wildlife officers inspected the scene and confirmed the attack was a direct result of scent attraction during late-season feeding. The incident served as a grim warning to other hunters. Even the most controlled setup meant nothing against a Kodiak's speed, strength, and hunger. It was January 9th, 2019, deep within the snow-covered Carpathian Mountains of Romania, where silent pine forests stretched across frozen ridges and the wind carved sharp patterns into the drifts. Mihai Dragomir, a 45-year-old hunter from Brasov, had spent most of his life navigating the harsh winters and dense woodland trails of the Carpathians. Trained from a young age by his father, a former forestry ranger, Mihai knew every scent, sound, and shift in the mountain terrain. He was careful, disciplined, and experienced with long hunts for red deer during the cold months when food for wildlife became scarce. This winter, snow lay deep across the slopes, covering every fallen log and narrow path. The temperatures had dropped far below freezing, and the forest was nearly silent except for distant breaking branches and the muted rush of wind through high cliffs. Mihai had been tracking a herd of red deer for hours, studying hoof marks pressed into the soft, white ground. His pack held only basic supplies: a small loaf of bread, dried meat, fire starter, a hunting knife, and rope. Enough for what he expected to be a single-day pursuit. The ridge he followed grew steeper, and icy layers beneath the powder made every step dangerous. He advanced carefully, boots sinking deep into the snow. Visibility was low as light snowfall drifted through the trees. He moved slowly along a narrow ledge when the ground suddenly gave way beneath him. Hidden ice shattered, sending him crashing down a slope. The fall was fast and brutal. Sharp branches scraped his back before he landed hard on a frozen rock below. A sharp, searing pain shot through his right leg. He tried to stand, but it gave out instantly. The bone was clearly fractured. The forest around him remained silent, indifferent to his fall. He realized he could no longer walk. The ridge was isolated miles from any road or shelter, and night was approaching. He forced himself to crawl toward a cluster of fallen branches and half-buried logs. Every movement burned with pain, but he worked quickly, knowing that freezing night winds would soon arrive. Using trembling hands, he built a crude shelter, packing snow for insulation and layering branches overhead to block the wind. With numb fingers, he ate small pieces of dried meat and bread, rationing every bite. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply below zero. Snow drifted against the thin walls of his shelter. He curled into his coat, fighting the cold that crept slowly into his bones. The first night was long and brutal. His breath turned to frost inside the shelter. He barely slept, conserving energy, listening for anything that moved outside in the darkness. Dawn brought no warmth, only heavier winds. His injured leg throbbed with pain, and each hour became a struggle simply to stay awake and keep from freezing. He knew rescue might not come soon, and worse dangers might arrive first, drawn by scent and weakness. Mihai spent the next day trapped inside the crude shelter, his injured leg stiffening as the cold worsened. His breath came out in slow clouds that froze on his scarf. He forced himself to stay awake, knowing sleep in this cold could end in silence. He gathered what branches he could reach without leaving the shelter, and struck a small fire using dry bark and a flint. The weak flames gave little heat, but the smoke rose just high enough to drift upward through cracks in the snow covering. He hoped that someone far along the ridge might see it. He ate only a few more bites of bread, saving the rest for the night. Every sound outside, the snap of ice, a distant movement, made his pulse rise. He could smell the sharp scent of pine and hear the soft hiss of constant falling snow. The world felt vast, white, and empty. That night, the temperature fell even lower. Winds pushed snow against the fragile walls of his shelter. Sometime after dark, a faint crunching sound began circling the area. Mihai's heart raced as he recognized the low growl and soft, huffing breaths of wolves. The pack had followed the scent of blood from his injury and the faint smell of stored meat. Their gray shapes moved silently in the darkness beyond the snow-packed entrance. He held his knife ready, body pressed low, hardly breathing. The wolves grew bolder as the hours passed, their growls growing louder, their movements slow and calculated. One of them pushed its snout through a small gap, hot breath hitting his hand. Suddenly, snow gave way at the entrance as one wolf lunged fully inside. Its claws tore into his arm, ripping fabric and breaking skin. Mihai struck hard with his knife, jabbing forward with every ounce of strength he had left. The wolf snarled and jerked back as other wolves snapped from outside, agitated by the sudden motion and smell of fresh blood. The shelter shook as they circled again, scratching at the snow and branches. Mihai stayed completely still, his injured arm burning, waiting for the next attack. But eventually, as the night thinned toward morning, the pack drifted away, distracted by easier prey somewhere deeper in the forest. 3 more days passed in endless cold and hunger. Mihai built tiny fires whenever his hands could still move, sending thin trails of smoke through the cracks. He waved burning branches upward during daylight, hoping to be seen. His mind drifted in and out of awareness. The pain, the cold, and the silence blended into one long blur. He thought often about collapsing into sleep, but each time the fear of freezing kept him conscious. By the 4th morning, his body was almost too weak to move at all. His fire had nearly gone out when faint voices and crunching footsteps reached him through the snow. A forestry patrol spotted the rising smoke through binoculars. They moved quickly, digging through snow to reach the small dome of branches. Mihai was barely conscious when they pulled him out, his face pale, his arm torn, and his legs swollen and purple beneath the ice. They lifted him onto a sled, wrapping him in insulated blankets and rushing toward the nearest outpost before the next storm arrived. Mihai survived after treatment for frostbite, deep wounds, and severe exposure. His story spread across mountain villages as a reminder that in winter wilderness, injury invites death not only from cold, but from the predators waiting silently in the snow. It was October 28, 2021, in the vast desert plains of southern New Mexico, where endless dunes rolled beneath an open sky and the dry wind carried the scent of sagebrush. Logan Price, a 35-year-old hunter from Santa Fe, made his way across the sand with quiet focus. He had spent years hunting in rough terrain, from rocky canyons to grassland basins, and had gained a reputation for patience and discipline. Hunting pronghorn was one of his specialties. Their sharp eyesight and speed made them difficult to approach, requiring careful movement and constant awareness of wind direction and cover. Logan had started before sunrise, driving along dirt tracks until he reached a remote stretch of desert, far from ranch roads and human noise. He carried a .270 Winchester rifle and a spotting scope slung across his shoulder, using it to scan the open land for signs of a mature buck. The morning was clear and calm at first, with golden light spreading slowly across the dunes. Small clusters of sage and sandstone outcrops gave him places to hide as he moved slowly across the shifting terrain. He eventually spotted a small herd of pronghorn feeding near a low ridge. The animals were alert, their ears twitching with every sound. Logan moved downwind, making sure his scent would not reach them. Each step was careful and silent, boots sinking into fine sand. He stayed low, using scattered brush for cover, advancing slowly to close the distance without alarming the herd. His breathing remained steady, and every movement was controlled. Desert hunting demanded patience, and Logan had plenty. But as he neared a sandstone shelf overlooking the herd, the weather changed without warning. From the southwest, a wall of copper-colored dust began to rise, carried by a sudden blast of wind. Within seconds, the sky dimmed and the horizon vanished. A violent sandstorm swept over the dunes, wind howling through the sagebrush. The air turned thick with blowing sand, stinging his face and filling his eyes. Visibility dropped to just a few feet. Logan dropped to one knee and tried to shield his face with his arm. Sand blasted against his skin, biting like needles. Grit filled the action of his rifle, grinding against the metal. He turned to retreat but stumbled over shifting sand near the sandstone ledge. The wind roared harder, carrying noise and motion from all directions. The pronghorn herd panicked. Shadows moved all around him as the animals bolted in confusion, racing blindly through the storm. Their hooves tore across the sand, kicking dust into the air. Logan tried to stay still, but before he could react, a large buck appeared out of the swirling haze. Its horns were lowered, eyes wide in fear. With the storm blinding it, the animal charged straight toward him through the sandstorm, driven by pure panic and instinct. Logan braced himself as the large buck charged through the wall of sand, its hooves tearing through the dunes with powerful speed. Its lowered horns cut the air only feet away. The wind howled so fiercely that he could barely see its outline until it was almost on top of him. In reflex, Logan thrust the rifle downward and fired a warning shot into the sand. The gun kicked in his hands, but the blowing grit had already jammed the action, grinding inside the mechanism. The buck veered slightly at the blast, but its momentum could not be stopped. It struck the sand just inches from him, kicking a shower of debris into the air. The collision of hooves against shifting ground rattled through his chest. The force sent Logan stumbling backward down the sloped edge of the dune. He fell hard onto his shoulder, sliding as sand filled his sleeves and boots. Sharp stones scraped his arm and side as he rolled. The wind whipped more sand across his face, making every breath sharp and dry. Above him, the herd continued to thrash in the storm, their silhouettes barely visible in the blinding haze. Panic had taken control of the animals, and their hooves pounded wildly in every direction. Logan managed to stop himself by digging his boots into firmer sand near the ledge. The air was thick with dust, his skin raw from the wind. He could not see more than a faint outline of the nearest dune. Instinct kept him low to the ground. The storm roared for several long seconds more, the world reduced to noise and flying grit. His hands shook as he wiped his eyes, trying to regain clarity in the chaos. Then, almost as suddenly as it had come, the wall of wind began to shift east. The storm thinned just enough for him to see the horizon again. In the fading dust, the herd scattered, disappearing into the open desert. The large buck was gone, its hooves leaving deep marks across the sand, where it had nearly trampled him moments before. The burning sting on Logan's skin and the pounding in his chest reminded him how close he had come to disaster. He stayed still for another minute, making sure no animal charged back through the storm. The wind settled to a steady gust, no longer tearing at the dunes. Slowly, Logan rose to his feet, breathing hard. His arm and shoulder burned from impact, and blood seeped through fine scratches along his forearm. He checked the rifle, but the action was clogged with sand and unusable. The desert had turned a careful stalk into pure survival. He made his way back across the dunes toward the ridge where he had started, stepping carefully to avoid slipping again. The sand still shifted beneath his boots, and the air remained heavy with dust. Only faint tracks showed where the herd had once been. The hunt was over. The desert had made its own decision. By the time he reached safer ground, the sky was clearing and light returned to the landscape. Logan understood more deeply than ever that out here, the land itself was as dangerous as any predator. A single shift in wind had nearly ended him, not from fangs or claws, but from the wild panic of prey and the brutal force of nature. It was a lesson carved into every sting across his skin. It was March 9, 2018, far out on the drifting sea ice of the Chukchi Sea, off Alaska's remote northern coast. The sky was pale gray, and wind tore across the frozen landscape with a constant, bitter force. Travis Calloway, a 45-year-old hunter from Nome, had spent most of his life in Arctic conditions. He was experienced in navigating shifting ice, tracking polar bears, and reading sudden weather changes. Raised in a fishing family, he had learned survival skills from a young age, traveling across frozen bays and hunting seals during long winters. To him, the Arctic was a living force, magnificent but merciless. That morning, Travis was following the tracks of a massive male polar bear that had been seen hunting seals near a field of broken floes. He carried his rifle across his chest, his face wrapped in layers of cold weather gear. Each step sent a dull crack through the ice below, reminding him that the frozen sea was never solid for long. The surface was a jagged maze of white slabs, some flat as stone, others tilted at dangerous angles. Beyond the horizon, nothing but frost and wind stretched as far as the eye could see. The air smelled of salt and sharp cold. Thin fog rolled low across the ice, making it hard to see more than a few dozen yards ahead. Travis followed a trail of deep paw prints, each larger than his hand, frozen into the crusted snow. He moved with caution, spreading his weight to prevent sudden breaks beneath his boots. The Arctic was silent except for the distant groaning of the ice as it shifted slowly beneath the pressure of the moving sea. Then the weather changed without warning. A sudden Arctic storm swept in from the northwest, carrying blinding snow that sliced across the air like glass. The wind roared over the ice, filling the air with spinning shards that stung Travis's face. Visibility dropped almost instantly. The cracks beneath his feet grew louder. The ice trembled and split open in jagged lines, seawater spraying upward in violent bursts. Travis crouched low, steadying himself as the sound of splitting ice echoed across the frozen sea. In the middle of the blizzard, through a sudden break in the swirling snow, he saw movement ahead. Less than 50 yards away, a giant male polar bear emerged through the storm, white against white, moving silently over the unstable floes. It had been stalking seals, but now its head turned toward him, following the scent carried through the wind. Before Travis could shift position, a massive slab of ice beneath the bear tilted sharply, sending the animal sliding toward him. The polar bear lunged, claws scraping across the ice, sending a wave of shattered frost and snow into the air. Travis stumbled backward as the full force of the charge came within seconds. In desperation, he raised his rifle and fired into the bear's shoulder just as it reached him, the impact knocking the beast off balance. The massive bear staggered sideways from the impact, its roar swallowed by the shrieking wind. Snow and ice shattered beneath its weight as it spun, then backed away into the blizzard. Its outline vanished almost instantly in the white haze, swallowed by the storm. Travis remained on the fractured ice, chest heaving, rifle still raised, waiting for the shape to reappear. But only the sound of cracking floes answered him. The ice beneath him moaned again, louder this time. A jagged fissure split open just a few feet away, dark seawater spraying upward. Travis dropped to his knees to lower his weight, shifting toward a thicker slab. The surface tilted under him like a moving raft. Every motion had to be deliberate. The storm showed no sign of slowing. He could barely see his own boots. His clothing was soaked from the ice spray and the cold began to cut deep into his bones. He crawled instead of walking, spreading his arms wide to distribute his weight. Each time the ice trembled, he froze completely, listening, waiting for the next break. Breathing was painful in the freezing wind. His eyelashes were crusted with frost and his fingers, even inside heavy gloves, were going numb. He did not dare stand. Instead, he crawled over shattered blocks of ice, moving from one shifting floe to the next. The storm pushed everything, wind, snow, and even the floating ice beneath him, in relentless motion. Somewhere beyond the blizzard, the wounded polar bear still walked these same unstable slabs. Travis knew that even injured, it was fast enough to return before he could prepare another shot. Another crack ripped through the ice. A large slab split apart behind him, dropping into the sea with a heavy splash. Freezing water sprayed across his back, soaking through the cloth and gear. His body tensed instantly as the cold bit deep, a sharp burning that soon began to feel numb. He forced himself forward, dragging his weight toward a larger, slightly higher ice platform ahead. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He could no longer distinguish the sound of his movements from the groaning ice and the howling wind. He crawled for what felt like endless minutes, lungs burning from the cold, vision flickering between white and blur. At last, the snow eased slightly, the storm thinning just enough to see faint shapes in the distance, darker ice ridges that promised thicker ground. With his strength fading, he pushed himself across the final jagged stretch. Every muscle ached. His hands bled through the ice-soaked gloves. When he finally reached the larger shelf, he lay flat, pressing his body against it as the last cracks of the breaking floes echoed behind him. The polar bear never returned. The storm raged on, but the ice beneath him was now stable enough for him to move. Slowly, he continued forward until the wind softened and the floes connected back towards safer ground. By the time he reached the edge of the sea ice, he was shaking violently, soaked through, teeth chattering uncontrollably. The realization hit him hard. He had survived not only a predator, but the unforgiving force of the Arctic itself. In those frozen miles, the storm and the moving ice had been deadlier than teeth or claws.